Okay, so I'd like to talk with you today about the work of John Hattie. Some of you are familiar with him. He's from New Zealand and has done the grandfather of all meta-analyses by compiling thousands and thousands of studies to see what it is that we do in education, what works and what doesn't. So you can see that he's compiled 70,000 studies and keeps adding to it all the time. And what he's looking at is the effect size of the different approaches that we use in education. And so some things have virtually no effect, some things have a negative effect, some things have a positive effect, and some things have an extremely positive effect. Keep in mind that a 1.0 is the equivalent of 2 to 3 years growth for a student. So one thing that Hattie found when he looked at all this, he compiled 195 influences on education. And when you use 0.0 as the bar, it turns out that 95% of what we do in education has a positive influence. Almost everything works. So this is why people can argue for their pet projects, because there's research behind it, because virtually everything works for some kids, some of the time, somewhat. So Hattie says all you really need to do to have an influence in education is a pulse. So he argues that we need to use a different barometer. We can no longer use 0.0, because when you look at all the studies that he looked at, the yellow bar is actually the growth a child makes from simply developing over the year he's in our classrooms. The orange is simply the growth that they make from having been exposed to education over the year. He's saying instead we need to use the middle part. 0.40 is our new bar. That's what he calls the hinge point. And everything from there over, it falls in the zone of desired effects. So this is what we should be aiming for, growth that is 0.40 or higher. So what are some of the things that we find that are maybe not effective in education? So there are some things that have a negative effect, and these probably don't surprise you. These are actually the only things that he found that had a negative effect out of 195 influences on education. You probably are not too surprised by some of these. Now, some things have a neutral effect, meaning that there's really not much difference that's made. These things fall in the yellow and orange areas on the barometer. These are just simply the same as having been in school or having developed on their own. Some people might be surprising. Ability grouping falls pretty low. And then, of course, what people want to know is what ranks at the very top. So what we have at the very, very top are some effects that we've actually been talking about over the past couple days. Notice at the very, very top, teachers' collective efficacy. That's simply the idea that all of us is smarter than one of us. So this is collaboration, and notice the enormous effect size that this has. Self-reported grades, Hattie says he actually wished that he had called this student expectations, that when students believe they can do something, then their growth is enormous. Micro-teaching is actually simply videotaping yourself and then debriefing and discussing it with someone afterwards. These are enormously powerful rankings. But now one thing that Hattie's newest research, is not just looking at overall effectiveness, but looking at phases of learning and when we teach what. So he has now looked at, when you look over the course of time, like over the course of a unit or a year, particularly with a unit, you're looking at starting with surface learning, moving into deeper learning, and then working at helping kids transfer their learning. And so these approaches underneath each are approaches that work particularly well during these phases of learning. This is really interesting. If you look on the far right, problem-solving teaching has a very high effect size when done for transfer of learning towards the end. However, when it's done at the earlier stages, the effect size is 0.15. So it really matters when we teach what we teach. So Hattie gives us a really interesting tool for looking at our effectiveness. He says, one of his big kind of quotes is to know thy impact. And a huge effect for teachers is when teachers collaborate and discuss about their impact and the effect size of what they do in education, then there's an enormous impact on students. So I've included a link here that is to his website. Also, there was a link on the prior page that will give you an idea for the overall effect sizes. the main thing to think about, Hattie says, is let's not think about what works, let's think about what works best.